Hello everyone, welcome to this Delivery Associates Network webinar titled An Introduction to Value Engineering. My name is Ian Morehouse. I'm a Chartered Project Manager at Arup in London. I started my career as a graduate project manager at Network Rail, and my project highlights included working on the new Western Concourse as part of the King's Cross redevelopment programme and the formation of the Wessex Capacity Programme, responsible for the conversion of the previous international terminal at Waterloo for domestic rail services. I joined Arup in 2016 and took project management roles on projects including the Canary Wharf Crossrail station and spent several years developing proposals for the new high-speed 2 station at Euston. In the last few years, I moved away from rail to focus on energy major complex projects, including being Arup's project manager for our technical advisor commission with the UK government for the new gigawatt nuclear power station at Sizewell C. Here's the agenda for the webinar. We'll look at the definitions of value and value engineering. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between value management and value engineering. We'll spend the majority of the webinar going through a typical value engineering methodology, highlight a couple of limitations with the process, identify some further reading and material that's contributed to this briefing, and run through a couple of hypothetical frequently asked questions. So what is value? In simple formula terms, value is the functionality of an asset divided by its cost. Value is the ratio between the benefits and the cost or effort required to achieve those benefits. Value is inherently relative. Different project stakeholders and participants will have their own perspective on what constitutes good value. With that in mind, value can kind of be inherently imbalanced. It requires effort to manage these imbalances, and it can be quite intense for sponsors and project managers to make sure primary value is delivered to the client and its funders, offset against what other stakeholders, project stakeholders, may consider to be value. Value engineering is a process to improve the value of your project by identifying cost or time reduction opportunities that do not adversely impact the required project function or the primary outcomes of the project. Value engineering reassesses the assumptions made during design and perhaps even early construction to identify more cost-effective ways of achieving the same desired primary project outcome. It focuses on removing unnecessary cost or time also driving cost from a project, not removing necessary costs required to deliver the scope, or downgrading the specification below the performance level required by the client or funders. And it's worth remembering that the savings that can be delivered by value engineering, or for that fact for value management, decrease as the project progresses. So the earlier these interventions are taken, the opportunities for savings are greater. So you may hear the terms value management and value engineering being used interchangeably. It's quite common. Whilst ultimately the aim of both processes is to achieve better value for clients and funders, the two approaches are also different. Value management typically occurs earlier in the project lifecycle. It's a strategic level review of the proposed project requirements and outcomes. The aim is to refine or update the project brief to better achieve value. And if I use a common example here, a value management level review could be looking at alternative routes for a new highway bypass with the aim of still bypassing a village or town, but by having a route that costs less, either directly in terms of capital cost or in time that then drives costs to achieve. By its nature, value management will probably require a different type of engagement with stakeholders, potentially quite senior stakeholders within client and funding bodies, because the impact of that change potentially affects business plans, corporate strategies, and longer term visions and aspirations. Value engineering is, I guess in simple terms, a bit more bread and butter. It's typically undertaken later in the project lifecycle, certainly relative to value management, when primary requirements and project outcomes are better defined and fixed. It's more tactical in its approach relative to the kind of strategic nature of value management. Usually involves participants from the client, the supply chain, so designers, contractors, specialists, as well as key relevant stakeholders. And if we carry on with the example above, this could be perhaps looking at opportunities to reduce the number of lanes required in that same highway once the primary route of it has already been decided earlier in the design process. And this briefing will focus on value engineering in particular, rather than more strategic value management. I've included the graph on the slide here. It illustrates the relationship between the potential impact a change can have on a project relative to its cost of implementation over the project lifecycle. In very simple terms, the earlier the project change is initiated, on this side of the graph here, the greater potential it has for positively impacting the project's value while minimizing the potential cost of actually making that change. Once you reach this point here, where the cost of a change is greater than the likely positive impact it's going to have in terms of cost or time benefits, then additional justification may well be required for making that change. Whilst it probably seems a little bit counterintuitive, there may still be good reason for implementing project change on this side of the graph, where the cost of the change is greater than the impact. And that could be for, examples including perhaps changes to relevant codes and standards, changes in legislation, or other potential safety critical reasons to make changes to the project later in its delivery life cycle. Before we talk in more detail about the process of value engineering, it's worth considering how a project's definition matures over time and the associated allowances in terms of cost and time risk and uncertainty provision that should be provided to reasonably cushion the impact of issues arising during the development and delivery of the project. In general terms, a project should be increasing its cost, schedule, and risk certainty over time. This is achieved through maturing the definition of the project and maintaining a configured set of risk provisions in line with this maturity. I've included here on the slide a series of project definition criteria that are matured over the project development lifecycle. This could be, for example, maturing the project's benefits definition and mapping how those benefits are realized. It's maturing the requirements, the technical requirements of the project and the scope that then turn into contractual requirements within the supply chain. It's developing the design, taking it through assurance gateways and increasing levels of detail and integration. It's managing a project's assumptions and exclusions and having risks associated with those should they not be borne out to be true. It's maturing the cost estimate in line with the developing design. It's the use of benchmarks from equivalent projects, particularly early in the project lifecycle, to give a level of confidence in the target range for risk. It's engaging with the supply chain, either through design and then later into construction, to get input into the way the project is going to be built. And it's also recognizing the impact of external finance issues, including inflation, tax, etc. And those risks are tracked through project risk registers, risks to capital cost and delivery, risks to the project schedule, which then in turn likely drive cost impacts. Those costs and schedule risks are modeled through QCRA and QSRA processes. Those risks are often transferred to other parties through commercial and contracts arrangements that are made with the supply chain. And the trade-off of that transfer often happens with a level of commercial incentivization for other parties to take those risks. One useful reference point for the target ranges of estimate accuracy is the Infrastructure and Projects Authority's, the IPA's, cost estimating guidance, shown on this slide. It uses the UK government business case life cycle of strategic outline and final business case to give you some target ranges around maturity with a kind of optimistic and pessimistic position in terms of maturity ranges. It's a good reference point to have in your mind, particularly for complex projects. Okay, this slide sets out the summary methodology for a typical value engineering exercise, and it's where we're going to spend most of our time on the webinar. A value engineering methodology can be broken down into 6 steps, itemized on the slide here. Those 6 steps can roughly split out into 3 broad phases in my mind. I've called them preparation, the workshop, and then action. And over the next few slides, we'll run through what each of these steps mean in more detail. In the preparation phase, it's a lot of information gathering, understanding the problem that you're trying to solve, and further preparation in terms of functional analysis, identifying and agreeing with stakeholders and funders the primary and secondary functions of the project and where there are tolerances for what can be tested in terms of what's included and could potentially be excluded from the project scope. That preparation enables you to have an effective value engineering workshop. And that workshop splits into 2 main elements: creative thinking, identifying different solutions to the project brief you're trying to solve, and then a period of analysis, evaluation, and shortlisting, evaluating the different solutions you've identified. That's typically where the workshop would end, and then you have a period of work or action after the workshop where you develop your shortlisted solutions in more detail, probably carry out another round of analysis, likely to be more quantifiable in terms of cost and schedule, and then you'd identify the best solution and make a recommendation in the final presentation stage before going through governance and instructing that change into the baseline. As per the note at the bottom of this slide, it's recognised that this approach takes time and effort. For simple projects, an alternative, less structured approach may be more applicable, perhaps only utilising some elements of this methodology focused around the workshop stage. Okay, so preparation, the first stage, understanding the problem. And this comes back to understanding the value criteria for the project. What outcomes have you got defined in your project brief? These could be, for example, what design life you're trying to achieve, what materials and durability requirements are you specifying in the design, what capacity requirements does your project or asset have? And if we go back to our example of a new road, this could be the number of lanes, the maximum speeds, the provision for different transport modes, and segregation of those modes. What stakeholder value criteria are there? These are criteria that you may not have specified in the brief, but you should be aware of in terms of stakeholders and their ability to influence the project and what outcomes they're expecting to see. These could also be requirements that have been enforced through planning and consenting arrangements, and potentially additional environmental or sustainability requirements enforced by a planning body. It's important to know how these outcomes translate into the technical requirements you've developed in the project specification, either held internally or instructed down through the supply chain to designers and contractors. Particularly, identify what technical requirements don't map back to your high-level project brief. And these are potentially areas for action in the value engineering process. The next stage of preparation is the function analysis. This is a methodology for determining a project's primary and secondary functions. And this bit of analysis can be undertaken by a small project team or even an individual in advance of a value engineering workshop. Typically, it will be undertaken by a sponsor with support from a project manager. We talk about primary and secondary functions. Primary functions are functions that should not or cannot be compromised in the execution of a value engineering exercise. Secondary functions are optional, and they provide convenience and a value add to the project, if you like. In undertaking this analysis, we use function statements. They are kind of in a verb noun format and are kept deliberately abstract so to not predetermine what's acceptable or non-acceptable. An example on the right hand side of the slide, taken from a really good RICS paper on value management and value engineering, is included here for a function analysis of an office development. And you can see the verb noun approach in the primary functions in the middle column and the secondary functions in the right hand column. So a good example of a primary function would be minimize downtime, and a secondary function that contributes to that primary function would be provide backup power supply or provide emergency decant space for tenants. Those secondary functions are areas that should be tested and challenged as part of a value engineering exercise, especially if they're not completely essential to delivering that primary function, or if there are other ways to deliver that primary function at a reduced cost or time. The costs associated with delivering those functions can be estimated, and this is potentially where you involve other team members and colleagues. And once you have an understanding of the value of those component parts, you can then identify areas for potentially focusing in on in a value engineering workshop. So before we go into the actual stages of the value engineering process associated with the workshop, I thought it'd be important to talk about the workshop itself and setting up the right conditions to be successful. I personally recommend it's really important to have an independent facilitator for the workshop to brief them on the project and the desired outcome you want to achieve as sponsor or project manager. That doesn't mean you're giving them undue influence or pushing them in a certain direction. You're asking for someone to be independent, to come and chair and facilitate the workshop and get the best input out of the participants. Secondly, I believe it's really important the workshop is held in person wherever this is practical. It's a workshop, it's not a meeting or a briefing. You should expect the people who attend to participate in the workshop. In advance of the workshop, prepare printed drawings, ideally a plotted A0, A1 type scale, and find and bring along the necessary stationery, post-it notes, pens, highlighters, etc., to allow people to collaborate on the material. For those of you able to do so, encourage participants to move around, to engage with the workshop materials, and to talk to each other. It's those smaller engagements where actually idea generation becomes easier for many people, especially those not comfortable speaking up in large groups. It may be that you need to have smaller breakout sessions on specific subtopics. For example, understanding whether a construction sequence is feasible for a particular option before you decide to take it through to any sort of short listing. And it's really important to allow sufficient time. Workshops can often start slowly and it can take a while for the room to warm up, so to speak. And quite often the workshops can feel like they're just about getting going, and then at the point you're getting kicked out of a meeting room or people have to go on to other commitments. The value engineering workshop will start with introductions of those who are present and should then include a short 20 to 30 minute probably technical introduction to the current project scope, where it's at in terms of its development, and an introduction probably best from the sponsor in terms of the challenges being faced on the project budget and or its schedule that have led to the workshop being required. In other words, what is the scale of the challenge that the team present at the value engineering workshop are seeking to resolve through identifying options? I'd like to talk a little bit as well about who attends the value engineering workshop. It's best when you've got a diverse set of people who are informed and invested in the delivery of the project. As a bare minimum, we kind of expect the sponsor, project manager, quantity surveyors, designers, both architects, engineers, and if they're appointed, representatives from the contractor and or wider key supply chain partners. It could also be relevant to have other specialists present, for example, those involved in environmental consents, sustainability, or planning and regulatory requirements. And for large, complex, multidisciplinary projects, you might also include other technical specialists from engineering disciplines. For example, pedestrian modelers for stations or airports. The first then main stage of the workshop is to move into creative thinking. This can be difficult for lots of people for understandable reasons, particularly sharing ideas that perhaps aren't fully formed in public and with people from different perspectives and experience. And this is where an independent, proactive facilitator can really add value. The aim for the creative thinking stage of the value engineering workshop is to capture as many potential value improving solutions as possible. And the key word there really is potential. And it's important that those participating in the workshop suspend any existing judgment they have and or positions or roles or seniority during this element of the workshop in particular. It's really important that the facilitator enables a period of brainstorming that avoids criticism or assessment of suggestions that people are coming up with. And it may be better to split into fewer or smaller groups to support those more comfortable engaging in that environment. One idea generation approach could be to consider the opposites or the reversals of what is already in the scope. And I appreciate in some instances that can come across as quite silly, but actually in some instances it can prompt idea generation down the line that adds value. Another behavioural approach could be to ask people to, for want of a better word, kind of role play in another person's shoes or another individual's shoes, or in the shoes of someone approaching this from a different project role, as a way of seeing past an individual's either biases or blind spots based on their existing role in the project. It's also really important in the creative thinking to consider not only the what, but also the how, the methodology of how the project is delivered, such that both direct and indirect project costs and schedule durations can be reviewed, challenged, tested, and opportunities identified during the review. And I would expect this element of the workshop to allow at least an hour, probably 90 minutes for this, to get people's creative juices flowing, to get dialogue going, and to start to refine and develop some sub-options. And for large, complex projects, this could take multiple hours. Once you've identified a long list of options, a good first step is to plot them on a grid like this. Those options are most likely captured on post-it notes or on markups of drawings or on a whiteboard in the workshop, and it's quite easy then to translate them onto this grid. And again, I personally would recommend doing it quite manually and simply rather than involving IT at this stage of the process. The grid maps the potential return or benefit in terms of capital cost or schedule along the x-axis for a given option against the cost of implementing that option, either in terms of design, in build, approvals, risk, interfaces, complexity, etc. This approach enables you to quickly focus in on the smaller subset of options in the green box, or nudging very close up to that green box, that should be considered for shortlisting, whilst also discounting options that don't give you the required level of return relative to the cost or complexity of implementing them up in the red box. Moving individual options over onto a grid like this also helps you identify potential opportunities for combining individual options or discrete options together for a greater collective impact. And in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I made earlier. This is a photo taken from a workshop held earlier this year, where identified options were captured on post-it notes on drawings and then transposed onto the physical copy of the grid printed at A0. And I like this photo because you can see where we've started to consider clustering options together to form greater value options. And what we've also done is then started to codify those options with reference numbers on the post-its, so that then in the scribbles at the bottom right hand of the photo, you can see that we've started to think about different permutations and combinations for adding those options together and recording those down. Once you've got a short list of options, it's important to then move on to their analysis and evaluation. Ultimately, this is going to be specific to the project, the requirements of the client, of the funders, and the governance necessary to make change decisions. In general terms, you should quantify the methods of evaluation wherever possible. Cost in pounds and pence, time as a factor of the schedule, capacity, carbon is another good example, or availability percentages. We're not expecting at this stage that you produce detailed, precise estimates, but use professional judgment to look at cost and time ranges associated with the potential benefits of the shortlisted options. Where you can't quantify a function a relative qualitative scale can be used, and those ranges are typically 1 to 5, also 1 to 10. Doing this is fine, but it's probably important that for key contributors and decision makers, you define what that scale looks like and agree it in advance. Where you've pulled over a lot of options into shortlisting, you can use a yes/no prompt approach to very quickly try and whittle some of those down. And that question could be about whether it meets the mandatory primary functions you've identified earlier in the process, for example. And where you're not doing that, you quickly get that option off the table. And again, when you start shortlisting, there's then another good opportunity to consider looking at combining options to achieve a value improvement while also reducing the number of options you're going to take forward to shortlisting. And what you're effectively left with, and there's a really good example of this in the RICS paper, is a table with options at the top of each column with a series of evaluation criteria across the rows. You've got quantified data wherever possible, even if it's in ranges. Qualitative scores. You then convert the quantified scores into a ranking in line with your 1 to 5 approach, and you end up then with a series of an overall ranking of the options you've brought forward. And that's most likely where you get to in terms of the face-to-face workshop sections of the process. And to be fair, it's likely that for the shortlisting process I just talked about, you might actually want a separate session, either directly after or shortly after your idea generation session, such that there's a clear delineation that you've stopped idea generation and you're now focusing in on appraising the options you've identified. But taking those shortlisted options through to a final selected option means you're probably going to have to do an additional level of technical development, of analysis, and potentially detailing to better understand those cost and schedule impacts associated with your shortlisted options. Where a detailed cost analysis is required to inform that final option selection, this is where the project team should probably engage with a wider set of designers and quantity surveyors to agree the level of design detail to be produced for each option that then the QSs would need to work up a cost position. It's really important here for client teams to remember that this effort will likely incur additional costs and needs to be considered in the round when looking at the overall benefit of running the VE exercise and the amount of additional effort you put into developing multiple options to then down select to one. And it may be that actually you need to reconsider the amount of effort you put into developing shortlisted options if actually the return you're going to get afterwards doesn't wash its face. Wherever possible, the amount of development work you do should be considered relative to the target benefits you're trying to achieve. And being really clear and upfront with the sponsor and with funders at this stage is important. And finally, presentation. This is about closing out the VE process. By now, you've identified a set of shortlisted options. You've taken them away for a degree of further development so you can better understand the cost and schedule impacts of those options. And once that's been suitably matured, you can then reapply those shortlisted options into the appraisal process, rerun it, and identify a single preferred option or a single preferred combination of options. It's then good project governance and probably required for future assurance reviews and audits that the outcome of this process is captured in a written report. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. In many cases, a level of project governance and assurance will be required now to endorse that selected option, take it through into the baseline, and potentially to update relevant consents and approvals applicable to the previous iteration of the project design. This is also the time it will be beneficial to undertake an additional round of stakeholder engagement to provide feedback on anyone that contributed to elements of the process, or at the bottom end of the RACI scale, to inform those who require informing of a change or development in the project, and to communicate next steps, particularly where delivery schedule may have been impacted by taking a pause for the VE process. And finally, a reminder that changes made as a result of the VE process to the project scope or its brief will require formal instruction to the designers and the contractors involved in the project. And as mentioned, all of this should be captured in a value engineering report that catalogues the outcome of the process. This formal record should include the process that you followed, which could be just as I've described today, or it could be a variation of it, what you did, who was involved, when you did it, and how you did it. It should record the decision or decisions made. In other words, it should record what options you selected, and this is where you should include perhaps a snapshot of the grid I showed you earlier, and you should also include evidence of your appraisal table, both with quantified and qualitative measures included. As part of that, you also highlight the alternative options that you discounted, and you should summarize there why they were discounted. It's important you here also capture the assumptions and the exclusions you identified in going through the value engineering process. And associated with that, you may want to capture the residual risks associated with the decision you've taken and the forward route you're taking. And those residual risks can then transfer into the project risk register at the next suitable review. And where the VE report forms part of a wider piece of governance, you should capture those governance requirements in any necessary next steps. Limitations of the value engineering process, and this also applies to a degree to value management. I've touched on some of these earlier, but it's important to flag these now. I can't stress enough that allowing insufficient time will limit the value, for want of a better word, of this process. And that's time to prepare, it's time to run the workshop itself, and it's time afterwards to follow through on the commitments you made in the workshop in terms of appraising options, developing a short list of options, and then taking those shortlisted options through to a final decision. There's another limitation around the level of precision you can reasonably achieve in running a value engineering process relative to the maturity or the stage of the project. And it's important up front for the client, for the funders, for those who participate in the process to understand and agree the level of precision in terms of design maturity, and in turn in terms of cost and schedule that you're going to get from when you execute your value engineering exercise. And this is where ranges again are your friend in terms of cost and schedule. You're not going to get down to a detailed position on cost or schedule impact of options when you're dealing with sketches and initial ideas generated in a workshop setting, and people need to get a level of acceptance around imprecise views on options, particularly at an initial idea generation stage. A key fundamental limitation with value engineering is when the process is started too late in the project lifecycle, and that kind of comes back to the graph I had earlier in the webinar in terms of the impact of change relative to the benefit you get out of it. I've listed this as a limitation, but it's more a consideration for the client and the funders to make in planning their workshop, is unnecessarily excluding or limiting valuable stakeholder involvement in the value engineering process. That doesn't mean you have to involve them throughout the whole thing, but you introduce an inherent risk if you don't involve decision-making stakeholders in the process, and then they feel like a decision is being forced upon them without feeling like they've been engaged in the process. And I come back to my recommendation from earlier in the call that you potentially run your initial idea generation session with an informed project audience, and then once you have a shortlisted set of options, you can then potentially engage a slightly wider stakeholder web to contribute to a refinement of those shortlisted options. And the final limitation here, and it's not the final limitation in totality, it's the final one I want to talk to today, is an undue focus on previous options that have been discounted. And what this effectively means is you don't allow sufficient headspace and time for the identification of new options. And again, this is where it's very important to leverage the benefits you have from an independent facilitator who doesn't carry the kind of the baggage, the history, and the scars of the project's development to date. So some things there to consider in planning a value engineering process. I mentioned earlier in the briefing some links to further reading, and here they are. There's some hyperlinks and the titles on the screen. These papers have been really useful for me, both in kind of general project delivery life, but also in the preparation of this briefing, and well worth a read, particularly I think the IPA cost estimating guidance in general, and the RICS value management and value engineering paper, if you're planning a value engineering exercise anytime soon. And finally, as I can't be there with you in person today, thought it'd be a good idea to run a hypothetical frequently asked questions section at the end of the webinar briefing. The first question I could come up with was, how do you know when to run a value engineering exercise instead of value management? And I know I touched on this at the start of the call, but in summary, there's no single universal rule on this. Value management is typically undertaken earlier in the project lifecycle, where the impact of strategic level change in option selection, including doing nothing, are more palatable to the client and the funders. Value management typically involves senior stakeholders from client and funding organizations, because the decisions that are being made can impact organizational level business plans, project strategies, and have a sizable impact on commitments that have been made. Value engineering, on the other hand, typically occurs when the project and its outcomes and its requirements are better defined and set. It can often occur almost as business as usual, as good practice to make sure what the project is delivering is relevant to the scope that's been defined. It's often undertaken once the delivery, procurement, and supply chain arrangements are in place, utilizing expertise from designers, architects, contractors, and specialists to refine initial proposals without impacting the overall value proposition. And then the final thing I kind of wanted to observe here is that in some instances, particularly on complex major projects and programs, you can actually see conventional, almost business as usual value engineering occurring alongside separate strategic value management. And this can particularly happen when there are external factors impacting the validity or questioning the validity of the overall project. And you see this on big programs, Crossrail, High Speed 2, other big infrastructure projects. and they might be driven by significant external factors like a change in government or a change in policy. And what happens here is that the core project team proceeds with project development, identifying opportunities through value engineering reviews, while a smaller, often ring-fenced expert team might carry out a strategic review of the project outcomes and associated requirements offline to protect the validity of the baseline project delivery path. So you can end up in an environment where VE is occurring alongside VM, which is a bit of a funny one, but it does happen in extreme examples for the most complex and critical of projects and programs. The second question, do you have to have an external facilitator for your value engineering workshop? No, you don't have to, but I certainly recommend it. Having a facilitator who's removed from the day-to-day of project delivery allows all project team members to participate in the value engineering exercise. It reduces the risk of bias and potential blind spots when you do your idea generation and optioneering, and it introduces a level of objectivity that actually may be relied upon when you go through future governance and assurance sign-offs. So yes, I think you should have an external facilitator for these sessions. It's also a great development opportunity for people in your organizations who might want to step into those shoes for a little while. And finally, who should be attending my value engineering workshop? As a minimum, I recommend there's broad coverage from across the project team. This includes the project sponsor, project managers, quantity surveyors, designers, contractors, and relevant specialists, potentially in consents and environment and sustainability, as well as technical specialists relevant to the project. It may be applicable to include external project stakeholders, and this decision needs to be taken on a project-by-project basis. It should be considered relative to the sensitivity of the project with that given stakeholder party and the importance those stakeholders have in achieving successful project outcomes. One potential solution, particularly where you're trying to contain the communication of issues associated with the project to a risky external project audience, is to hold an initial value engineering workshop with an informed project group, identify the subset of shortlisted options, and then hold a secondary session with stakeholders to gain their input and engage them in emerging viable options prior to a single final option being selected. And you can then quite easily say, well, actually, no, if other options are suggested by that stakeholder party, you can acknowledge them and you can evidence that you've already considered them, but you're not taking them forward because they don't align with the criteria you require them to achieve the right level of outcome. And that's the end of the webinar introducing you to value engineering. That's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.